Last year, DJI sent me over their RS3 Pro combo with the LiDAR autofocus rangefinder. I'd seen it in action on a few other YouTube channels already, so I was pretty keen to put it to the test. Now, over the years, I've tried a lot of gimbals thanks to this channel. Some of them were terrible. They never made it past the testing phase, and I never made a video about them because of that. And some were fantastic, and I reviewed them and used them on client work, which is always a good testament to whether a piece of kit is actually any good. But I'd never used a DJI gimbal before, and I'm realizing now just how much I'd been missing. Now, it's not to say that Zhiyun or Moza don't make good gimbals. They do, they make fantastic gimbals. But the attention to detail that's gone into the RS3 Pro, it just puts it on a whole other level for me. Let's start with the first thing, the main thing this video is about. The most incredible thing, the LiDAR autofocus rangefinder. Basically, take any manual lens and add autofocus to it. My Helios vintage lens was a great lens to test this with because it's already been modded with cine gears, and it's fast enough to really see just how accurate the LiDAR is when it's driving the focus motor.
So to test this out for you here, I've got my vintage Helios lens mounted to the A7S III. Now, this lens was never designed with the intention of being an autofocus lens. This lens was designed before autofocus existed. And yet here we are, me walking 2 meters towards you, kept tack sharp in focus without the need of a focus puller.
To set it up, it's really quite straightforward. Smack the LiDAR module on top or under the camera. I just put mine in the hot shoe of the camera because that's kind of the default calibration that it's set to in regard to the distance of the focal plane of the camera, which you can find on your camera with the little circle and the line through it, or to get really nerdy, that guy right there. Then you connect it to the correct ports, so from the rangefinder and the focus motor into the correct ports on the gimbal. Then you can create a lens profile for that lens, set your focus on an object 1 meter away, set your focus on an object 4 meters away, and boom, you're done. That lens profile is saved on the gimbal for future use, so you don't have to do the setup every single time. And in fact, if you take the camera off of this whole setup and then put it back on and you reselect that lens profile, all you need to do is calibrate the motor, which means that you just double tap the FN button on the rangefinder and it will just run through the entire focus throw of the lens, and there it's done. It knows where it is on that lens. And you can store up to 3 lens profiles on there, which is really nice. If you're working with a set of primes, for example, then you can easily switch between them. Now, the little screen on the back of the gimbal shows you what the LiDAR is seeing thanks to the built-in camera that is actually in the rangefinder. That's what the rangefinder part means. And you can select areas on the screen by tapping or dragging a selection box for those areas to focus, no pun intended, for the rangefinder to focus on those areas alone. Or if you're just in the default wide mode, it will recognize someone's face and track that automatically. Or if you've got 2 people in shot, it will track the person who is the closest to the lens, and then you can easily switch between them. And if you want to, you can even tap the trigger button once to initiate active track, which will then keep the gimbal centered on that subject so that as you're moving around, they're kept in shot. And that works pretty well. I don't find that it works quite as well as using the Raven Eye feed, which actually takes a feed from your camera, so you're tracking what your camera's seeing rather than what the rangefinder's camera is seeing, which is a wide lens. But it does work pretty well when you're on a wide angle that matches the rangefinder's. But in terms of the face tracking, it's good. It's really good. And because LiDAR works by pinging light pulses with a laser, the consistency of the autofocus accuracy is pretty solid regardless of how dark your scene is. It's able to keep the subject in focus where the Sony's autofocus, or any other camera's autofocus for that matter, would fail and start hunting in extremely low light situations or low contrast situations. Now, it does have its limitations, of course. Shooting anything beyond 10 meters, it's a gamble, and you'll quickly notice it starting to fail. So if you're hoping to smack a 200mm on this and single out focus on a subject far, far away, forget about it. It's not designed for that. And because it's using a ping response rather than phase and contrast to find its focus, you're going to get some interesting results if you try and shoot through glass and water or sort of non-reflective surfaces that allow you to see through them, non-opaque surfaces, I should say. And inversely, to the maximum distance, you also start noticing issues if you try to focus extremely close to the lens. Because of the offset of the LiDAR, the vertical and horizontal offset of the LiDAR, from the focal plane, and sometimes even the lens itself obstructing the laser. But honestly, that's not been something I've experienced in the last year of using this. I guess I just don't like putting my camera inches away from people's faces. But otherwise, it feels almost magical. I know that sounds cheesy, but that's how it feels when you're able to add a whole new approach to a vintage lens, or any manual lens for that matter. Now, this system is somewhat bound to the gimbal, meaning that to do any kind of calibration, you have to first run through the gimbal. But once that calibration is set, you can then remove this and have it as a fully handheld or shoulder rig or crane or slider mounted system, and the LiDAR will continue focusing for you, driving that focus motor, but you need to be able to power it independently. Now, DJI recently brought out a power cable solution so you can power the focus motor and LiDAR rangefinder independently of the gimbal, which means once you've calibrated the lens, you can remove the camera from the gimbal and use the LiDAR in a handheld setup, or however you want to use it. So really, I've got to say I am extremely impressed with this. Of course, it is a tool that has a very specific purpose. I would infinitely rather have a focus puller who is pulling focus for me than relying on the LiDAR rangefinder. But the LiDAR rangefinder is an invaluable tool to any kind of solo shooter or very small crew where you can't afford to have someone who is pulling focus for you. It is just a game changer in that regard. And I really think DJI are setting the ground here to revolutionize independent filmmaking. I think we're going to be seeing more and more of these LiDAR systems because they just work so bloody well. I'm going to make a call here. In 5 years' time, I bet you that little focus assist light on the camera is going to be able to work as a LiDAR ping as well. That's my call. Check back here in 5 years. You can say, you were wrong. Anyway, there's a link to the RS3 Pro combo with the LiDAR rangefinder down below if you're interested in buying it and supporting this channel. It will be an affiliate link, I hope. Now, I've talked about how great this gimbal is, but I mentioned some gimbals that weren't so great. Let me know in the comments what your worst gimbal story or experience is, and I'll pin the best one. All right, I hope you enjoyed this and you found it useful. Give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button if you want, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.